Are you looking for an adventurous summer job? Well, how about hunting invasive Burmese pythons in the Everglades? The South Florida Water Management District is paying $8.10 an hour to hunt the slithering creatures.
A motion-triggered trail camera mounted deep inside the Big Cypress National Preserve just captured something scientists have no explanation for. Dr. Michael Kirkland positioned 37 cameras across a 12-mile corridor of South Florida wetland with one mission: document the Burmese python invasion. The camera ran for 6 weeks. When he pulled the memory card and loaded the footage, what he saw shocked him. He picked up his phone, called his team, and ordered them to come over now. What that camera recorded was not a python, not an alligator, not any species the survey had been designed to document. It was something none of the working models had predicted would appear in that ecosystem at this point in the python invasion.
I saw like a little tiny bit of its pattern, and I followed it up a couple feet to the biggest head I've ever seen. And so I jump on her. I was like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? I think I'm insane.
And what that camera found could be the one thing that finally ends this python war for good. The night a storm set a monster free. To understand what the trail camera captured and why it is so important, you need to know how the python invasion began, how bad the problem has become, and what this ecosystem really looked like before the pythons arrived. On August 24, 1992, Hurricane Andrew slammed into the southern tip of Florida. Winds tore across the coast at 165 miles an hour.
Here are the effects of Andrew as he begins to arrive here on Miami Beach. You can see the palms blowing, and then over here.
The storm killed 65 people. It destroyed $27 billion worth of property in a single night. But the storm broke open something else, too. Something nobody thought to count in the disaster report. South of Miami, a reptile breeding facility held row after row of Burmese pythons. The hurricane ripped the enclosures apart. Cages that held dozens of massive constrictors caved under the wind. The snakes spilled into the flooded streets and vanished into the water. Nobody searched for them. Rescue crews were busy pulling people out of collapsed homes. Missing snakes were the last thing on anyone's mind. That single night planted a disaster that would take 3 decades to fully surface. And Hurricane Andrew was only one piece of it. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Burmese pythons became popular pets across South Florida. They arrived as tiny hatchlings, small enough to hold in one hand. Then people discovered what they had actually bought. Within a few years, that little snake could grow past 12 feet long. Suddenly, it didn't fit comfortably inside a tank. It was enormous, incredibly strong, and difficult to control. So some owners made a disastrous decision. They drove into or near the Everglades and released them. They thought they were getting rid of an unwanted pet. They were introducing a massive predator into an ecosystem completely unprepared for it. The Everglades gave that predator everything it needed to thrive. Over 1.5 million acres of warm, wet wetland stretched out in every direction. The heat never let up. The food never ran out. Every animal in that swamp had spent thousands of years learning to survive alligators, bobcats, and panthers. Not one of them had ever seen a Burmese python. Almost immediately after these monstrous things arrived, they began taking down every single native animal in the Everglades. Researchers studying the invasion soon understood why native animals stood no chance. They began piecing together how these attacks actually played out, and the pattern was always the same. A raccoon would walk through the grass one evening, the way it always had. It would have no idea a Burmese python was coiled in 2 inches of water nearby, holding perfectly still for hours. The snake would sense the raccoon's body heat before it ever came into view. It would stay motionless as the raccoon stepped closer. unaware it had already been marked. Then the python would strike, faster than the raccoon's brain could even register the danger, and it would be over before the raccoon understood what killed it. Dr. Frank Mazzotti, a wildlife ecology professor at the University of Florida who helped build the response to this invasion, put it in words that stuck with every researcher who heard him. He said releasing Burmese pythons into the Everglades was like releasing wolves into a petting zoo. As soon as they arrived there, these pythons didn't just survive, they multiplied at a horrifying rate. A large female Burmese python can lay dozens of eggs in a single clutch, sometimes approaching 100. She coils around them and can actually produce heat through muscular contractions to help keep them warm. This is a behavior almost never seen outside of birds. No predator in Florida had ever developed a way to stop her, and none had a way to stop what hatched. Population estimates today place the number of Burmese pythons in South Florida at 100,000 animals at the low end. Some research teams working deep in the western Everglades believe the true number could be as high as 300,000. That means 300,000 apex predators now live in an ecosystem that had 0 of them 20 years ago. In 2012, Mazzotti published a study that measured exactly what that meant for the animals living there. Raccoon numbers had collapsed by 99.3%. Opossum numbers had crashed by 98.9%. Bobcat numbers had fallen by 87%. These weren't small dips. These were near total wipeouts. The researchers dug deeper. They began opening up captured python. What they found inside left every single one of them pale. In 2013, a hunter caught a 14-foot python with a stomach bulging out of its body. When scientists opened it up, they found 12 deer hooves packed inside its intestines. That single snake had swallowed 1 adult deer and 2 fawns, over 160 pounds of prey in one feeding. In 2022, biologists cut open an 18-foot python and found something that stopped them cold. A 5-foot alligator sat inside its stomach, fully intact. The armored plates covering the alligator's skin hadn't even been damaged. The python had swallowed a living armored predator whole. Necropsies kept turning up worse discoveries. Inside python stomachs, biologists found the remains of the wood stork and the key Largo wood rat, 2 species already protected by federal law because their numbers were already dangerously low. The pythons weren't only eating what was abundant, they were eating animals the country was actively fighting to save from extinction. But the numbers alone don't capture what happened to the Everglades. The silence does. Mazzotti has driven the same roads through the Everglades for more than 3 decades. In the 1980s, he couldn't travel 100 yards after dark without slowing down for an animal crossing the road. Now his team can drive for miles and see nothing. No eyes catching the headlights. No movement in the grass. Only the sound of the engine in a silence that should never exist in a wetland this alive. He remembers one exact spot on that road. Back in the 1980s, he parked there and counted 53 different mammals in a single 2-hour watch. A few years ago, he drove back to that same spot. He stepped out of the truck into the dark and stood completely still, waiting for animals. He saw nothing at all, not even an insect. The swamp that once teemed with life had gone completely silent, as if every living thing in it had simply vanished. This isn't only about lost wildlife. The Everglades filters drinking water for millions of people. It protects entire cities from flooding. It recharges the aquifers that supply one of the fastest-growing regions in the United States. Ecologists have valued its work at more than $31 billion a year. The small mammals the pythons wiped out sat at the base of that entire system, feeding the birds and reptiles that keep the wetlands water clean. Florida wasn't just losing animals. It was watching a predator quietly tear apart the foundation the entire Everglades stood on. Someone had to stop it. So the state sent people into the swamp to hunt these snakes down. What they found waiting for them in that grass would test every one of them. Ghosts in the grass. Florida State launched the Florida Python Challenge, a public hunting competition run by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Anyone could sign up. Anyone could walk into the Everglades and try to remove a python with their own hands. In the 2024 event, hunters spent 10 days combing the swamp. They removed 195 pythons. That number sounds impressive until you check it against the real population. If 300,000 pythons live in South Florida, those 195 snakes make up just 0.065% of the total. A single breeding aggregation could replace every snake removed in that competition within one season. The Python Challenge wasn't solving the problem. It wasn't even scratching the surface. Florida needed something stronger. So the state moved from a public contest to full-time professional hunters. These hunters signed multi-year contracts with the South Florida Water Management District and Florida Fish and Wildlife, and they worked specific zones of the Everglades every single day. Donna Khalil became the first woman hired for this job. She has hunted pythons in total darkness for years, and she describes the work in one blunt phrase. She calls it hunting ghosts, because these snakes are almost impossible to find. She has described sweeping her headlamp across the canal for hours and finding absolutely nothing. A python can lie completely still in the grass for that entire time, and it looks nothing like an animal. It looks like a root sticking out of the ground. Only once in a while does she catch it. She has described what she finally sees. It is a python's body, as wide as a telephone pole. It doesn't move the way the plants around it move. It is coiled so tightly that it could pass for part of the swamp itself. That's the only warning she gets before she knows a python is right there. Finding the snake is only half the job. Donna has described what actually catching one does to her body. She has waded through waist-deep swamp water for 6 or 7 hours straight, night after night, searching for shapes that refuse to be found. She has straddled 200-pound pythons in total darkness and pinned it down with her own weight, fighting to keep it from throwing her off. She has lost count of how many times those jaws have sunk into her skin. And every python she drags out of that water gets replaced by another one, hidden somewhere close, waiting to be found the same hard way. What crawled through that same water next would make every one of those bites look small. The danger doesn't stop at bites. In one hunt, 2 hunters, Leonardo Sanchez and Nicholas Banos, tracked down a 144-pound python, a snake that weighed nearly as much as Sanchez himself. When Banos reached for its head, the python whipped back and struck him directly in the face. Sanchez dove chest first onto the thrashing snake and pinned it down by hand while it twisted violently through the trees around them. Other hunters have paid for this work in a different way. During one python challenge, 2 men lost their bearings deep inside the Everglades. They wandered the swamp for hours in the heat until a helicopter had to search the wetland and pull them out. By the time rescue crews reached them, both men were suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Since the contractor program began in 2017, these hunters have removed more than 23,000 pythons from Florida. That sounds like a massive number until you compare it to the total population again. Even 23,000 snakes still represents less than 5% of the pythons living in the Everglades. the population fills the gap as fast as hunters can empty it. Every piece of technology Florida tried after that failed just as badly. Thermal drones were supposed to spot pythons from the air by tracking their body heat. But pythons are cold-blooded. Their bodies match the temperature of the plants around them, so the drones couldn't tell a snake from a bush. Robotic decoys built to lure pythons out into the open failed too. Pythons are ambush hunters. They don't chase moving targets. They wait in silence for real prey to walk past them. Only one method actually worked. Researchers built what they call the Judas snake program. They surgically implant a GPS tracker inside a mature male python and release him back into the wild. During the breeding season, that male leads researchers straight to a group of females waiting to mate. Ian Bartoszek pioneered this technique, and it has led his team to some of the largest breeding females ever found in Florida, some weighing more than 200 pounds. The Judas program removes more pythons per hour than any other method used in the Everglades. But even this wasn't enough. The Everglades stretches across more than 1.5 million acres. No team of hunters, however skilled, can cover ground that size with the staff Florida currently has. The situation got even more horrifying when hunters in the field started saying something the state agencies didn't want to hear. Mike Kimmel, known across Florida as the Python Cowboy, has said it plainly in multiple interviews. The snakes are learning. They are pulling back into the deepest sawgrass and cypress hammocks, the parts of the Everglades where no hunter walks on a regular basis. The breeding populations are gathering exactly where humans struggle to reach them. The pythons are adapting to the hunt faster than the hunt is adapting to them. But a far bigger problem was already spreading through the same swamp, one no hunter could see, catch, or kill. And this thing wasn't hiding in the sawgrass, like the pythons. It was already inside the native snakes themselves, and it had been spreading for years before anyone noticed. The sickness nobody saw coming. The first sign of trouble showed up when Dr. Terrence Farrell, a herpetologist at Stetson University, was running routine health checks on native snakes to track how healthy Florida's snake populations really were. He wasn't studying Burmese pythons. He was checking native snakes, and what he found in them stopped his work cold. The native snakes in the Everglades, the garter snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, and eastern diamondbacks, kept showing up thin and weak. Their mouths hung open. They struggled to breathe with every movement. Farrell's team performed necropsies on the animals that died, and what they found inside left them staring wide-eyed in shock. There were parasites inside their respiratory systems. The lungs of these snakes were packed with dozens of small, pale, worm-like creatures, crammed together so tightly they filled the snake's entire airway. The creatures were still alive. They twisted and writhed against each other in a wet, tangled mass, feeding inside the snake's chest while the snake fought for its last breath. The snake was suffocating on the very things that were killing it. In snakes still breathing when researchers examined them, the creatures could be seen pushing their way out through the snake's mouth, slick and moving, spilling out past teeth that had gone still. The snake no longer had the strength to even close its jaw and stop them. Scientists identified the parasite as Rhylaetiella orientalis, known as the snake lungworm. Despite the name, it isn't a worm at all. It belongs to the same family as crabs and shrimp. It evolved for life in water millions of years ago, and somewhere along the way, it evolved instead to live inside a snake's lung. The parasite has 4 small hooks on its head. It uses these hooks to grip the tissue inside the lung and feed directly on the snake's blood while it lives there. A single lungworm can grow up to 4 inches long inside that same lung, and researchers have pulled out several fully grown ones from one animal at the same time. The snake wasn't only losing its ability to breathe, it was being fed on from the inside while it suffocated. This parasite originally came from Southeast Asia, the same region the Burmese python comes from. It didn't reach Florida on its own. It was living inside the pythons that were brought into the state, and it entered the Everglades hidden inside their lungs. In its home range, the python's body had spent millions of years adapting to this parasite. The python carries it. The python spreads it through its waste. But the python's immune system controls it well enough that the python rarely gets sick from it. However, Florida's native snakes had never met this parasite before. Their bodies had no defense built up against it. Farrell compared it to what happened when European explorers reached isolated populations who had never been exposed to European diseases. One side had built resistance over centuries. The other side had none, and the outcome was devastating. The infection spread through the food chain in the most ordinary way possible. An infected python released waste containing microscopic lungworm eggs. Cockroaches, found everywhere across the Everglades, ate that waste and swallowed the eggs along with it. A native frog then ate an infected cockroach. A native snake ate that frog. Every step in that chain was completely normal. Frogs eat cockroaches. Snakes eat frogs. This is how the Everglades food web has worked for thousands of years. Except now, any frog in that chain could carry a death sentence to the next snake that swallowed it. And the snake had no way to know until it was too late. One case showed exactly what that death sentence looked like up close. In 2023, biologist Jenna Palmisano walked through central Florida, searching through fallen palm leaves as part of her research. She spotted a pygmy rattlesnake lying still on the ground. Something about it looked wrong. The snake had flipped onto its back, its belly facing up, a position no healthy snake ever rests in. Palmisano knelt down and picked the snake up in her hands. Within seconds, the snake went completely still. It had died right there in her hands while she held it. Pygmy rattlesnakes only grow between 15 and 24 inches long, which means their lungs are small to begin with. Once the lungworm moves in, there is barely any space left inside for the snake to breathe at all. That is why this species has been hit harder than almost any other snake in Florida. Dr. Melissa Miller, a research parasitologist at the University of Florida, set out to map exactly how far the outbreak had spread. What she found alarmed the entire research community. At least 18 different native snake species were already infected across the state. The parasite had reached as far north as Jacksonville, more than 300 miles from where the pythons had first escaped. Then Miller's team uncovered something that changed everything researchers thought they knew about stopping this outbreak. The lungworm no longer needed the Burmese python at all. The parasite had cut the python out completely. It now spread on its own, moving through cockroaches, frogs, and native snakes without a single python involved at any stage. Every python in Florida could vanish overnight, and the lungworm would keep tearing through the swamp exactly as it already was. There was no longer any way to stop it at the source, because the source was gone. Florida was now fighting two invasions at once. The pythons were wiping out mammals from the top of the food chain. The lungworm was wiping out native reptiles from the bottom. Two disasters were tearing through the same swamp at the same time, closing in from opposite directions. But in the middle of all this mess, researchers found one snake that refused to fall apart. The Florida cottonmouth barely got sick at all. Farrell's team examined cottonmouths living in areas with heavy lungworm infection and found almost nothing wrong with them. Somehow, this one species was standing firm, while every other native snake around it was being torn apart from the inside. Nobody has figured out why, but somewhere inside the blood of that one snake might be the answer that saves every other species that has no defense at all. And while researchers searched for that answer, something else was quietly happening in the forests of northern Florida. Something that hadn't happened there in more than 50 years. This next part began with a very daring announcement. The eastern indigo returns. Florida's Wildlife Agency made an announcement that sent panic through northern Florida overnight. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, working with conservation partners, said it was releasing hundreds of large snakes into the wild on purpose. Residents reacted with fury. Phone lines lit up. Nobody wanted more giant snakes crawling through their state. But almost none of them had read past the first sentence. The snake being released wasn't a python. It wasn't a threat at all. It was the exact opposite. It was the eastern indigo, a snake native to Florida and Georgia that had once thrived across the entire southeast, and it hadn't lived in these northern Florida forests for more than 50 years. This release wasn't random. For years, conservationists had watched native predators disappear from Florida's wetlands while the python population kept growing out of control. Every study on the crisis showed the same imbalance. An invasive predator had taken over an ecosystem that was losing its own native predators at the same time. Bringing back a species Florida had already lost, one built to rule its own forest floor, was part of a much bigger plan. Conservationists wanted to rebuild what the state was quietly losing everywhere else, and the eastern indigo was about to become the animal chosen to lead that fight. Its scientific name is Drymarchon cooperi, and it holds the title of the longest native snake in North America. Its scales run so deeply black that they catch sunlight and flash blue-green, like oil on water. People who study this snake for a living don't call it impressive. They call it beautiful. But beauty isn't why this snake matters. What it eats is why it matters. The eastern indigo hunts other snakes. It is completely immune to the venom of every pit viper in North America, including rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, and copperheads. When it corners one of these venomous predators, it doesn't back down. It crushes the skull with raw jaw strength and swallows its prey whole while the animal is still fighting to survive. One Georgia wildlife biologist once caught an eastern indigo that had just eaten a young rattlesnake and vomited it back up in the excitement of capture. The rattlesnake looked dead. Then, an hour later, its tail twitched. The snake had survived being crushed and swallowed alive. Weeks later, someone photographed that same rattlesnake in the wild, alive, carrying the exact head wound that matched the attack. Dr. Dirk Stevenson of the Orion Society has spent more than 2 decades leading the fight to bring this species back. He calls it the Emperor of the Forest Floor. On the ground, in an intact southern forest, an adult eastern indigo has no real challenger. It regularly grows past 8 feet long, and some individuals have measured over 9. This emperor once ruled forests across Alabama, Georgia, and the Florida Panhandle. Then it lost everything. Development and farming wiped out 97% of the longleaf pine forest this snake depended on to survive. On top of that, hunters used to pour gasoline down gopher tortoise burrows to drive out rattlesnakes for hunting festivals. Eastern indigos sheltering in those same burrows died from the fumes or fled and never came back. They weren't even the target. They were destroyed by a hunt that had nothing to do with them. Without the tortoise burrows, the indigo had nowhere to survive the cold winter months, and the species vanished from the northern half of its range completely. The Orion Society refused to accept that this was permanent. In the early 2000s, they launched a captive breeding program. Then they spent more than a decade doing something far harder than breeding snakes in captivity. They rebuilt an entire ecosystem from the ground up in the Florida Panhandle. They restored the native grasses. They brought back the controlled fires that longleaf pine forests need to survive. They rebuilt gopher tortoise colonies so their burrows could return, because without those burrows, no indigo could survive a single winter. Once the habitat was finally ready, the Society began releasing captive-bred eastern indigos into the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve. Then, in late 2023, a trail camera positioned at the entrance of a gopher tortoise burrow captured something that stopped Stevenson cold. He watched the footage once. He didn't believe it. He watched it again and again. He played it back 11 times before he let himself accept what he was actually looking at. 2 eastern indigo hatchlings moved across the screen, each one no longer than a pencil. These weren't snakes the Society had released. Nobody had bred these 2 in captivity. They had been conceived in the wild, hatched in the wild, and raised without a single human hand ever touching them. For the first time in more than 50 years, eastern indigo snakes were reproducing entirely on their own in the forests of northern Florida. And there's a detail that makes this species even harder to kill off for good. Some isolated female eastern indigos have been documented laying fertile eggs without ever mating with a male at all. A single surviving female, completely alone, can still start a new generation by herself. The eastern indigo wasn't just coming back. The emperor was rebuilding a dynasty that everyone thought was gone forever. But an old enemy was still out there, and a new question was about to test everything this recovery had fought so hard to build. The collision course. The old enemy was still the same one Florida had been fighting for 30 years. The Burmese python hadn't slowed down, and somewhere in the middle of the Everglades, a scientist's cameras were still running, still recording, still trying to answer one question. How much damage was this invasion actually doing? That scientist was Dr. Michael Kirkland. Years earlier, he had positioned 37 trail cameras across a 12-mile stretch of South Florida wetland for one reason. He wanted to track the pythons themselves, how many were out there, where they were moving, and what their presence was doing to everything else living in that swamp. The cameras weren't built to measure exactly how bad things had gotten. After 6 weeks, Kirkland drove out, pulled the memory card, and loaded the footage that night, expecting more of the same grim math he had already documented for years. What he saw instead was something no camera in that swamp was ever supposed to catch. 40 miles into Big Cypress National Preserve, one camera had captured a 25-pound bobcat dragging a dead python through the mud toward the tree line. The python's head was already gone. The bobcat hadn't just killed this python. It had struck the head first, taken it out completely, and finished the rest of the snake after. The bobcat wasn't running from the kill. It was claiming the carcass, dragging it away like it belonged to her. For 20 straight years, the Burmese python had ruled the Everglades with almost nothing standing in its way. And that wasn't because Florida's native predators couldn't fight back. Alligators were physically capable of killing a python. Bobcats were physically capable. Florida panthers were certainly physically capable. The real problem had been simpler and far more dangerous. None of these animals recognized the python as prey. They had never seen anything like it before, so they never attacked it. That was starting to change. Over the previous 3 years, alligators had been caught on camera ambushing smaller pythons in shallow water. In Everglades National Park, a trail camera recorded something even rarer: a Florida panther, one of fewer than 200 left alive in the entire wild, stalking a python through a palmetto thicket for 20 straight minutes before finally closing in for the kill. The timing mattered. In cooler winter weather, a python's body slows down and reacts to danger far more slowly. Its head is also its weakest point, fragile against any predator fast enough to strike before the python can wrap its body around them for defense. For the first time in 2 decades, native predators were finding the opening they needed, and pythons were finally taking losses. This kind of clash wasn't entirely new. Back in 2005, rangers in Everglades National Park found the remains of a 13-foot python and a 6-foot alligator locked together in one of the most violent encounters ever recorded in the swamp. The python had tried to swallow the alligator whole. Its stomach ruptured under the pressure, and the alligator's tail was left sticking out through a torn hole in the python's body. The python's head was completely missing. Scientists believe a second alligator may have arrived and torn the python's head off during the struggle, the force of that final fight tearing the snake open for good. At the time, researchers had already documented 4 encounters like this in just 3 years, early proof that Florida's own predators were starting to collide head-on with the invasion. The Everglades wasn't recovering, but for the first time in 20 years, it was fighting back. And 200 miles north, a second front in that same fight was quietly opening up. The eastern indigo snakes that had just started breeding on their own in northern Florida weren't staying in one place. A growing indigo population naturally expands outward, and the direction it expands toward is south, straight toward the Everglades. A juvenile Burmese python, only 3 or 4 feet long, falls well within the size an adult eastern indigo can overpower and eat. Against a python that young, the indigo almost certainly wins. But a fully grown female python, 15 feet long and weighing up to 200 pounds, is an entirely different fight, one no indigo has ever been documented surviving. The researchers have been asked again and again whether this encounter will actually happen in the wild. Their answer never changes. They don't know. Nobody does. Nobody has seen it happen yet. But there's a real chance that if the indigo's range keeps expanding south, it could start killing young pythons before they ever reach breeding age. Every juvenile python that dies before it can reproduce is one less female laying 50 to 100 eggs a few years later. The indigo might never wipe out the pythons completely, but it could slow them down in a way nothing else in Florida has managed to. But these researchers aren't even losing sleep over the pythons. They are losing sleep over the lungworm. Can the same parasite that has been suffocating native snakes across Florida also infect the eastern indigo? The indigo's immunity to snake venom is extremely specific. It's built to neutralize particular chemicals found in pit viper venom, nothing more. There's no scientific reason to believe that the same immunity offers any protection against a completely different threat, like a lungworm. And this isn't just a fear anymore. A 2022 study already confirmed lungworm-related deaths in eastern indigo snakes. The infection researchers had been tracking through garter snakes, rattlesnakes, and diamondbacks has already reached the one species everyone is counting on to help destroy the python invasion for good. If the lungworm spreads through indigo populations before they grow strong enough to sustain themselves across the recovery zones, the parasite could wipe out the species before it ever gets the chance to do what conservationists spent 2 decades working toward. Nobody really knows how this ends. Only time will tell what happens next. Michael Kirkland still watches those 20 seconds of footage where the bobcat dragged the headless python through the mud. It isn't victory. It isn't even close to it. But it's proof that the Everglades hasn't given up. It is fighting hard. And just maybe one day, it will restore its former glory.